So today is our first seminar for 2024 for the Centre for Safe Air, and we will have a number of seminars throughout the year, and hopefully you will be able to keep track of all of the Centre's activities by signing up to the newsletter. So I think Bill will try and add the link to the newsletter in the chat so that you can join and keep abreast of everything that we're doing. The meeting, this seminar will be recorded, so if you aren't able to stay on, that's fine. I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country, excuse me. So I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land where I am today. But I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are living, learning and working from today. Very conscious in this environment. We're across the country and internationally, I assume as well. And I'd also like to pay respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who may be present today. So the speaker today is Professor Fay Johnston, and she's a public health physician and environmental epidemiologist who heads the Environmental Health Research Group at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research at the University of Tasmania. And her main research areas include bushfires, climate change, air quality and health, and the health impacts of wood smoke and air allergens, as well as interventions for protecting health from airborne hazards. And Fay is actually the lead investigator for the Centre for Safe Air, which is an NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence. And so today's seminar, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A section rather than the chat, and then I'll be able to go through those at the end, and Fay can respond to questions at the end. So I think that's all of the housekeeping, and I'll hand over to Fay. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming today. I'm speaking to you from Lutruwita, now known as the island of Tasmania. And I'm going to talk to you about fire. So I will share my screen and get into it. Just give me a second. Just getting into presenter mode. There, so I'm hoping that looks good. Amanda, pipe up if it's not the right view that you're all seeing. Good, okay. So I'm going to talk about fire, and I just want to make a couple of points first. Firstly, I want to acknowledge my co-authors. What I'm presenting today is really the content of a paper that's out as an e-publication, but it will be out formally as part of the 2024 annual reviews of public health, climate change, landscape fires and human health, a global perspective. And I'd like to acknowledge the whole team, Grant Williamson, Nico Butchers, Sarah Henderson and David Bowman, who collectively worked on this with me. Also, before I get into it, a bit of a content warning for those of you who've lived through extreme fires. I'm going to be talking a lot about it in probably a bit of a clinical kind of scientific way, and I'll be talking about a range of fires, but if it's not the right time and place to hear that kind of stuff, this is your opportunity to choose whether or not you stay listening. Okay, so just before I get in and tell you the outline of the course, I just want to talk about terminology. People talk about fires in different ways. In Australia, we often say bushfire. My North American colleagues often use the terms forest fire or wildland fire. Wildfires is a common generic term. So what do you think when we use terms like this? And why am I using the term landscape fire? And I can answer the final question very easily. I'm using it as a collective term to mean all kinds of fire in vegetated landscapes on Earth. but some people might think this is a scene from severe wildfire disasters in Greece, often called wildfire or wildfire disasters. Here's a scene from my hometown of Hobart, which is a fuel reduction burn. Some of you, if I say wildfires, might think and worry about and the Amazon and burning of tropical rainforests, which is this picture. I don't know how many of you, when I say the word landscape fire, think about Indigenous care of country and burning for country, you know, for millennia around the globe. And that fire is so beautiful and little in that lovely, healthy country. You can barely see it. Or there's another form, which is massive burning of agricultural crops and crop residue, an annual big event over huge areas of the Earth's surface. So all of these get detected by satellites as hotspots, and a lot of the data we have about fires actually can't tell any of these apart. It's globally detected burning in vegetation. So what I want to do today is make sense of that and the different types of fires and how they interact with our health and how they interact with the climate. And the way I'm going to do it is in 4 parts that I've got here. Firstly, go through some basics. I had to learn a lot as a medical practitioner when I started getting into fire. There's a lot of complexity with fire ecology and climate that's well beyond what you get taught in medical school. I'll show you a whole series of maps in the second section to illustrate some of these basics about where fire is and where the smoke is. Then I'll get into different types of fire and their impacts, what drives them, and how they relate to health and the environment. And I'll wrap up briefly by talking about ways we can work to reduce the harmful aspects of fire. So to get into it, first some fire basics. So fire is a fundamental process. We live on a fiery planet. It's absolutely crucial for the planet. It cycles nutrients, carbon, nitrogen. It's essential for reproduction of a lot of vegetation. So as long as we've had oxygen and vegetation on this planet, we've had fires. Very basically, to get a fire, you need 3 things. And the fire triangle is a very basic and important concept in any kind of discussion about fire, whether it be striking a match or whether it be a landscape fire. You need heat as an ignition source, you need oxygen, and you need the fuel. And in our case, it's mostly hydrocarbons, and for landscape fires, it's dry vegetation or dry organic peat soils for the most part. You get those 3 conditions. You know, oxygen is supported by wind, of course. Heat is heat waves or sparks, and fuel is the vegetation. Then it combusts. The oxygen combines with the hydrocarbon in the logs and the twigs, and what you get is energy, so a lot more heat, and that gives you the mechanism for fires to propagate. So they have their behaviour because energy is released and then it ignites the next bit of vegetation, and so it goes on. And of course, you get a lot of emissions. The carbon in the biomass or the logs and the twigs gets largely converted to carbon dioxide, but a whole lot of other things as well, particles, gases, and vapours. And that has implications for health, and it has implications for the environment and climate change. So that's the basics of the process. What drives fire? And I'm sure most of you think about fire and extreme fire danger days and the climatic drivers, and that's a really important shaper of how fires burn around the world. And I'll go through them one by one. With the notes I've got here in italics, I'm highlighting things that are changing as our climate changes. But really one of the most fundamentally important things is you can't have a fire without fuel. So fuel availability is a crucial driver. And when we're talking vegetation, we're talking drier vegetation. So vegetation that is dry enough to burn. In the mind of fire ecologists, if vegetation is wet, it's not fuel. It's wet vegetation, but it's not available to burn. And that's why we get seasonal fire seasons. You might look in a paddock and see exactly the same lot of twigs and leaves. But in winter, when it's all wet, it's not considered fuel. In summer, it can be all dried out and there can be an awful lot of fuel. And that fuel availability and dryness is a product of rainfall, humidity, and evaporation. So what's going on with climate? Climate is, of course, affecting all of those things: rainfall, humidity, and evaporation. So a warmer temperature means there's more evaporation, which means fuels overall, all over anywhere the climate is warmer, on average, fuels are drier. So on average, we've got more fuel everywhere. And then you've got influences of drought and reduced rainfall. That might mean there's more dead and dry vegetation. In the short term, there's more fuel there as well. And of course, the drier the fuels, the increased risk of a fire, should there be an ignition. Leads me to ignitions. In nature and with climate, the overwhelming source of ignitions is lightning. There's a few others like volcano eruptions, but lightning's the main one. And with the changing climate, we're seeing different patterns with lightning, and we're seeing more storms, what they call dry lightning storms in certain places, where you get a thunderstorm, but not necessarily the rain, but you do get the ignitions. So that's an emerging or growing phenomena in many places. And then finally, there's a concept of the rate of fuel accumulation. And this is really all about regrowing vegetation, particularly after a fire. Fire is very natural in the vast majority of Earth systems. The faster it regrows, the more rapidly you can get another fire. You know, eucalypts do it very quickly. Other types of vegetation take a very long time. And of course, this is influenced by climate change as well. Drought and reduced rainfall means there's reduced growth and reduced woody fuel. More frequent and intense fires means you're going to have fewer over the long term, long-lived plants. So overall, the progression can be from a lot of woody plants like trees. With a lot of fire, it will favour less long-lived, like with a lot of frequent fire, it will favour grasses and more short-lived fire-prone vegetation. So local fire regimes are sort of a biological, ecological concept, and that emerges from the interplay of all these factors in any given spot on the planet. So in addition to the climate drivers, we've got human drivers of fire, and I'm sure you'll be very familiar with what these are, but humans are an incredible source of fire ignitions, mostly accidents, sometimes arson, and there's a direct relationship between population density and rate of human ignitions of fires in the landscape. So it goes up in proportion to population density until you get to a big city, of course, and a big city a long way from any vegetation, it goes right down because there's not the vegetation there to burn. Human fire suppression. So humans can step in and change fires very dramatically, and they can do it across landscapes very effectively. So one way to suppress fires is to have policies like fire bans to reduce ignitions. The other way is to get out and put out every fire that burns. You know, the US had a policy of having all wildfires out by 10 a.m. for a good while there, and over time, that kind of policy leads to fuels accumulating, and then that, of course, shapes fires and fire risk as well. And then you've got human fuel reduction. It can be done quite deliberately to reduce the risk of fire. It can either be done through burning or thinning, or using animals to eat excess fuel, to eat the grass. And it can be done just through human activity, landscape modification, roads, settlements, fragmenting landscapes, clearing land. All of these reduce fuels and repurposing land for other purpose. And then finally, the big one now, which has influences nearly every aspect of fire and nearly every part of the planet, is human-induced climate change, as I described in the section on climate just before, the slide before. Okay, so that was a whirlwind of fire ecology and fire basics. Just to illustrate some of those points I made, I'm going to show you a few maps so you get a sense of global patterns in landscape fire. So let's start with this map from the Global Fire Emissions Database. The colours are really according to the underlying vegetation that's burning, And you don't need to worry about that too much. I really want you to look at where is it white? Where do we get fires and where do we not get fires? And I think you can see straight away up in the very northern icy boreal Greenland areas, there's not a lot of vegetation to burn. No fires there. You can see Sahara, you can see the top of Africa there, very little vegetation, so not much in the way of landscape fires. So desert regions, sort of polar regions, and then it's getting smaller and smaller. But if you look in the Amazon, South America, if you look at Central Africa, you can see white there. So this map was a composite of fires over a 10-year period. And in historical sort of pre-human times, rainforests didn't burn. There's an awful lot of biomass there, but it's so wet, it's not fuel for a landscape fire. It's very, very rare for it to burn. The way rainforests burn is through really strong and dedicated human intervention wanting to make them burn. And that's why there's a whole group in the darker green here called deforestation fires. And they're fires deliberately set to clear forest, particularly rainforest. You can see an awful lot of it in Southeast Asia and Amazonian region and a bit in Central Africa. So that's reflecting really fuel availability and how much land is burning. And this is a map that shows the percentage or the area of land that burns every year. And the main point I want to show you is those two dark bands in Africa. The central bit is where the rainforests are, but the most fire-prone and the most extensively burnt landscapes in the world are the tropical and subtropical savannas. We have a lot in the top of Australia. You can see a lot in northern and southern Africa and a lot in South America. These are the most fire-prone landscapes on Earth. The vast majority of area burned on Earth actually occurs in the savannas. So where is the pollution from all these fires? And here you can see Africa light up, combination of all the savannas and rainforest burning. You can see South America, similar. Southeast Asia, similar. A lot of Southeast Asia from rainforest deforestation. And you can see now the boreal areas, that's the very northern forests, are also beginning, it's less so historically, but now with warmer climates, a lot of fire emissions there. We know that smoke from fire is air pollution is a very important determinant of human health and well-being. So landscape fires contribute quite a lot at a global scale, quite a lot, maybe 10 or 20% of deaths, probably less of the actual emissions of particulate matter, for example. So this map is where are the deaths from fire-derived air pollution. And this is an estimate our team actually did some time ago. There have been more recent estimates, but it didn't have quite such a good map to put in context with the other maps. So I'm showing this one, but the general geographic pattern remains the same. And it's where you get the most smoke, which again is Africa and Southeast Asia, and combined with the most densely populated parts of the planet. And that's why South America hasn't lit up quite so much in this analysis, because the really densely populated and high fire smoke areas with pollution more Africa and Asia. But of course, it's everywhere. Everywhere there's fire. Okay, leaving aside the smoke and the health impacts from smoke, where are the extreme fires? And by extreme fires, I'm talking about the amount of energy released by a fire. So high intensity fires where you've got a lot of forest or a lot of biomass that's burning. And when these impinge on humans and human activities and cities, that's where the red triangles are. And this is a look over a 20-year period of documented major disasters relating to out of control and intense fires. And really what I want you to see here is that the pattern is different. It's not so much Africa and Southeast Asia. Savanna fires are totally integral to the landscape, and people who've lived there have lived with fires for a long time. The extreme disasters tend to be the temperate areas, the temperate forests, North America, Mediterranean, particularly southern Australia. And that's quite a different pattern. It's more higher income regions, whereas the intense impacts of smoke are more lower income regions, tropical and subtropical regions. Partly the corollary of that is, where does the research happen? And I don't have a map to show you that, but from my knowledge of the literature, the vast majority of research in impacts of landscape fire come from these very places where the red triangles are, right? North American countries and Australia, and also some European, some from other places. It's growing, but it means the research focus has tended to be on the kinds of fires that affect higher income regions, and there's been a huge gap, despite regular severe seasonal fires in many parts of the world. We haven't put in the research effort there as we have elsewhere. Okay, so that was the global overview. And what I want to do now is talk more specifics of different types of fire and sort of introduce this idea of a phenotype. Phenotype is a clinical word. It was actually my hook to get some clinicians interested in fire. In health and medicine, when you talk about phenotypes, for example, of asthma, it's recognizing that asthma is a condition. We know what it is: cough, wheeze, shortness of breath. But really, there's lots of different drivers, genetic influences, environmental influences, and there's recognizable patterns in how asthma is experienced by different, in different groups and different groups of people. And if you understand those patterns, you're better placed to help address the harm. And I'm using that analogy with fires by using the word phenotype. You can just say fire type. So it's a practical classification. It's not a biologically driven regime, but it's recognizable patterns that are common around the world. So distinct patterns in the manifestation of fires and their impacts on the population and the planet. And our group, when we were working on this, came up with 7 common fire types that are shown here in the big black writing. They can happen in various places over the world. So wildfire disasters in the top left, as I showed you in an earlier slide, really common in temperate and Mediterranean areas. So, of course, very common in Australia, common in Europe, common in Russia, Chile. So it's plotted there in North America as an example of where they occur, but it's not limited to there. Remote area fires, similarly, fires that generally occur far from human populations. It could be in Central Australia, but one of the most important regions where they're increasing is boreal forests. And then I've mentioned already deforestation fires, very specific fires to clear land. Savanna fires, been burning since the planet's been vegetated. South America, Africa, and Australia. Prescribed fires, and here I'm really talking as a tool for managing fire. And then indigenous burning, which I mentioned earlier, as part of deep tradition and caring for country in cultures all over the world. So there's an example there from Australia, but it's not the only example. So they're the 7 phenotypes, and I'll go through them one by one. First, I'm going to give you a bit of a classificatory system, a way of thinking about these. Sorry, I'll go back. Can I? 2 axes. On the left-hand side, the y-axis, you can think about fires from a very human perspective and environmental perspective, as how much good they do and how much harm they do. We need fire. Fire is integral. Not all fires are bad, so we can rank fires. Some are largely harmful, some are largely beneficial. And then we can also rank them on how much immediate human control there is. And some have not much human control, remote area fires, for an example. Some have a lot of human control. And if you rank these 7 groups in that way, you can see how they pan out, and that kind of immediately gives you some tools about thinking about which ones and where and how we can address the harms. So if you look at greater human control on the left side, there's 4 there, and they span the full spectrum. Deforestation, burning to indigenous burning, largely harmful, largely beneficial. If you look on the right-hand side, lesser human control. I mean, there's some control through our influence on the climate. And these are our disasters where it impinges on us as humans, and remote area fires. So largely lightning driven in remote places. Okay, so let's go through these one by one, and I'll make comments on impacts on humans' interactions with climate change and where the trajectories are with these fires. So here we have a photo of the Amazon burning, and its deliberate application of fire to facilitate conversion of forested landscapes to pasture or cropland. South America, it's generally soybean crops. Southeast Asia, it's generally palm oil. So they're the deforestation fires. These have huge public health impacts, but it might not be a huge area compared with savannas that burn, but there is so much biomass that's been stored and so much carbon stored for thousands of years in many places that can be released almost overnight. So these fires cause huge amounts of air pollution over huge areas, and it happens wherever we have tropical rainforest. So South America, Central Africa, Southeast Asia. The smoke, and mostly I've talked in terms of smoke impacts in terms of deaths, and I'll talk a little bit more about health impacts of smoke later, but we know that with air pollution in general, particles in the air, they influence health by promoting the development of chronic diseases like heart disease, lung disease, dementia, stroke. In the case of fires, because it's often intermittent, the big harm there is exacerbating or making these kind of conditions worse. So someone already at high risk of a heart attack, for example, very common condition in humans around the world, breathing in the extra air pollution from smoke can precipitate a heart attack, a cardiac arrest, or a stroke, or a severe respiratory illness. So that's what we're talking about when I talk about deaths related to fire-related smoke. Climate interactions, really important. This is what I alluded to earlier, but 10 to 20% of anthropogenic carbon emissions relate to burning our rainforests. So we get a lot of carbon emissions permanently lost. The rainforest doesn't come back so easily. A loss of storage, a loss of a sink, and of course, a loss of the habitat and plants that go with a rainforest. So pretty negative impacts on people, climate, and the environment generally. What's the trajectory? These are human driven, they're politically driven, it's complicated. South America, for example, had an appalling record of burning down their rainforest. Then there was a period where it was more under control. More recently, with the most recent government in Brazil, it's got worse again, and there's lots of factors at play. There's governments have some control, but not total control. Southeast Asia's, working hard on a transboundary haze agreement, but where you've got people operating outside of traditional legal frameworks, it's a really hard thing to control. So the trajectory is fluctuating. In theory, it could be stopped overnight because it's largely a human activity, but not for long, because as the climate warms, it's actually getting easier and easier to burn down rainforests and fragment them. So the warming climate is actually facilitating this, and then the huge emissions are facilitating a warming climate. So they're probably the most worrying fire type overall globally. Okay, and then another fire with a lot of human control. This is an interesting one. It might not necessarily come to your mind as a wildfire, but it certainly is a landscape fire, and it's incredibly important in many parts of the world. This is a scene from northern India. where you get huge areas that are burnt simultaneously to get rid of crop residue. And similar to deforestation fires, you get the terrible pollution over a wide area and it's seasonal. So you get all the impacts on human health I was describing. As far as climate interactions go, they're officially considered neutral. You know, you grow your crop and then you burn your crop and then you grow your crop and the carbon is re-sequestered. But there's a lot of initiatives going on in northern India, for example, the opportunity not to burn them, but to do other things and make products and sequester the carbon. So there's an opportunity here to do things differently, to reduce the health impacts and to promote carbon storage and help address the climate, warming climate. Trajectory is probably fair to say it's stable right now, but there's an area where there's opportunity. Okay, and this photo I showed you of Hobart, this is a prescribed burn, and I've got it in the middle. Not largely harmful, not largely beneficial. It's a bit of both, because they're done for a reason, and that's to reduce the hazard with severe fires. Prescribed burning. So as far as public health impacts goes, there's risks and benefits, and how these play out really depend on how often and where and how they're done. And this fire I'm showing you here, it's a fantastic fire from my point of view. It's hard to argue with. It's on the perimeter, it's reducing fuel loads, which means any severe fire in that vegetation will be easier to put out. These fires don't stop uncontrolled fires, but they make them much easier to fight. There's always a risk of escape and it turning into a wildfire. That's pretty rare. The main issue, and again, this depends on the place, is that because they need to be done frequently, that if we're protecting people, they need to be done near people and population centres. And then we're adding to our load from air pollution, and people at higher risk, particularly people with lung disease and asthma who suffer very quickly, have a health risk that needs to be managed. And, you know, knowing that these fires are going to occur ahead of time, for example, is a crucial thing that, you know, even with this fire, we don't do particularly well. I think in Australia, we've done a lot of prescribed burning. We're good at it. We're less good at letting the population know it's coming. Too often people wake up with their children and their lungs in, you know, needing help because of smoke that was entirely planned. So that's a great. Where I'm uncomfortable, I guess, is where you've got a lot of prescribed burning in a huge airshed like Sydney, and you've got 5 million people who get significant air pollution exposure. And we know that in a population of 5 million people, an awful lot are going to be at very high risk. And that's going to come with a rate of death and a rate of admissions to hospital. And we need to be really clear how the benefit is justifying an annual event like that. So it's all trade-offs. As far as an interacting climate goes, I think one of the most crucial things is the weather windows to do this well are changing because there's more fuel. So it's the time, and it's tricky for stable conditions to burn is usually a time that smoke doesn't want to blow away because you don't want to set fires if it's windy. But you can burn into winter as well. So they're shifting, and we're learning as we go with the best way of managing fuel with fire. Another important climate interaction is to understand that when we reduce fuels, we're reducing it on the ground mostly. If you've got extreme fire conditions and crown fires in the tops of trees, a nicely reduced fuel load on the bottom is much less effective. So under really catastrophic severe fire conditions, if a fire gets going, the effectiveness of the prescribed burning is less. So trajectories are varying, probably on the increase because the fire risk is increasing and there's a lot of complexities with the human and financial resources needed. Okay, change of step. I'll just check the time. Okay, I might speed up a little. Indigenous burning, fire's been used for millennia by Indigenous peoples globally to care for country and maintain a connection with nature. This is a photo I took. It's a clan estate in Arnhem Land where I've had the enormous privilege of being able to go most years for 20 to almost 30 years now. And this family have managed this estate, the same family group, for, at least 10,000 years. Their great-grandfather went to a community of Maningrida, but not for long, and came back. And the family's still there managing the land and burning as they go in different ways. I can't remember how long ago, looking at human health and environmental impacts, there have been a few studies. I'm very familiar with one I was involved with in this area that clearly showed a link to better human health outcomes in terms of things like cardiovascular risk factors and mental health and well-being in the people engaged in their country and burning country in this way. And the ecologists on our team also demonstrated environmental benefits, protection of biodiversity, protection of fire-sensitive plant species, and with a lot of nice little patchwork fires, an overall reduced risk of severe fires. Trajectories are interesting. The really traditional burning as done over the years, that's now becoming very rare around the world. But at the same time, there's been a fantastic renaissance by Indigenous peoples in many places of cultural burning and using connection and knowledge to reinvigorate the practice. And that's been a fantastic thing. And something that I guess also supporting provides opportunities for country, for people, and for fire. Okay, savanna landscapes. I'll just mention briefly seasonally dry fuels. The main public health issue is the smoke. The main climate issue, they're usually considered carbon neutral, but the changing warming climate means there's a tendency towards higher intensity fires. Interestingly, they're going down because of so area burnt on planet Earth is going down because of clearing of savannas, and that's not necessarily a good thing, but that's been the trend. And finally, remote area fires. This is Siberia. Again, far from humans, except for the long distance transport of smoke. And, my colleagues in Canada have suffered from smoke from fires in northern parts of Russia, for example. And there's a huge upward trend with climate, lightning fires, loss of carbon stores. As these forests dry out, they're becoming fuel sources like they never have been before. Okay, and finally, the syndrome of a severe wildfire disaster. And this is a photo from Greece, and I've got another couple of slides to talk about it. The impacts are quite extensive, both on health and climate, similar to remote area fires, loss of carbon storage becoming a source, contamination of waterways, and particularly in forested temperate areas, there's an upward trajectory. And this slide is an illustration of the many impacts on the environment and on humans that these kind of fires have. So I've mentioned some of them in terms of emission, loss of carbon storage, runoff and water degradation, which means building new water filtration systems for human populations. So soil degradation, water degradation, and then all the impacts on people of loss of infrastructure, power, farms, homes, livelihood, the trauma and psychological distress that goes with that, profound long-lasting impacts, and then social impacts that come through pathways like increasing unaffordability, insurance premiums going up in higher risk areas, and then, as I mentioned before, smoke-related increases in illness and death. And this affects not just where the fire's burning, but often millions of people further away. And again, there's inequity there because there's different population vulnerabilities depending on underlying health and social advantage or disadvantage. Okay, so just to finish off with some words about reducing harmful impacts of fire. Firstly, and most obviously, the crucial need for really accelerating global action on climate. Climate is driving fires, but fires are also driving climate. So all these fires have got upwards pressure on them for all the reasons I discussed earlier. Some of them, and the three I've highlighted, deforestation, remote area, and wildfire disasters, are promoting climate. They're releasing stored carbon, and they're on a vicious cycle of doing that more as the climate changes. The two where we've got a handle to try and do something because they are within human control. But again, it's not so much community, individual level action here. It's really global action on deforestation, burning, and probably more regional action with agricultural burning. But they're the opportunities. And an example here of how severe fires are Earth system impacts, just a study of the impacts of the Australian Black Summer, which was our worst season to date. Those of us in Australia know about the impacts on the people. We know about all the smoke that was here. You know, the estimate of deaths from smoke was over 400. What you might not know is that the ozone layer was depleted around 5%, thought likely to be attributable to the reactions in the stratosphere that go with that. So if we're getting more and more of these events, we're going to be undoing the gains of the Montreal Protocol. There was ocean cooling, and there was also ocean fertilization. So we had different patterns in our currents, and we had algal blooms. And then there was the ecosystem, you know, the damage and destruction of property and loss of life of the direct effects of the fires. So global ramifications, huge local impacts and global ramifications. And that's just one example. There's numerous others. Okay, so local actions to reduce destructive impacts. Managing landscapes, and really in simple terms, it's promoting the beneficial fires like prescribed burning and cultural burning, promoting non-burning green fire breaks, marsupial lawns. If you water lawns and get rid of the scrub, you know, in Australia, the kangaroos and wallabies will hop in and mow it down for you and make quite a beautiful landscape. There's lovely examples of that around Hobart. A mix of methods to reduce air pollution and reduce fire hazard. Of what we need surrounding our communities. And then for housing and communities, thinking about, we have a system called Bow ratings, but how fireproof the houses are, managing homes and gardens. And an interesting fact is that the studies, you know, Owen Price and our team have shown the risk of your house burning down if you're confronting a severe fire is much more associated with your own garden and the fuels in your garden than it is with the prescribed burning that might be done over your back fence in a national park. So learning how to have our gardens, how to manage the vegetation is a crucial adaptation step. And of course, there's a lot of education and outreach and equity considerations if you think about implementing some of these. Okay, and then air quality impacts and managing those, really that falls into three groups. Managing the source, very similar to what I said about managing the fire hazard, communicating early with deliberate fires. But then it's really for people, it's managing the indoor air because the refuge for severe pollution events is indoors. But we know the evidence on that. We need outside air penetrates in very quickly. So indoor air cleaners, HEPA filters, crucial to have in settings, homes and schools. A lot of research needs doing for outdoor workers and other settings, low income countries where you might not have nice sealed houses or capacity to have air cleaners. But thinking about our indoor air is a crucial part of adaptation. And then what can individuals do? And this bottom right box, you know, real-time communication, what the air quality is doing and how it's fluctuating. Education outreach, considering who needs there's illustrations here of the people at higher risk. How are we going to help people in those groups manage their health, know what the air quality is and know what to do? So a lot of applied research that needs doing. Okay, that was it. So that was a whirlwind roundup, the scene of all the various fires here. I guess to reiterate the key points, different fire types have a different mix of causes and effects. That helps us work out how to address them. Deforestation and savanna fires overwhelmingly drive human deaths related to fire through the smoke. Temperate forests, though, and boreal forests are the most sensitive to climate-driven extreme disasters, and they're increasing. And we are in a vicious cycle with fire. So collaborative effort globally, regionally, and locally is really what we need to do. So thank you for listening. I'll leave it there. Perhaps hand to Amanda and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Fay. That was an extensive overview of everything fire related. So thank you very much for doing that. And as you said, the paper will be publicly available in the near future. There are 6 questions at the moment. Oh, 8 questions. It's going up. So maybe we can run through these quickly, as I'm aware that we've only really got 10 minutes left. Question about the map illustrating extreme fires and extreme disasters suggests that there's a concentration in central and northern Australia. So is this area grassland, savanna, and somehow different from other savanna areas which don't have extreme fire disasters? Is it perhaps due to introduced grasses?
Yeah, I can comment there. I've discussed that with my fire ecologist. There's 2 things. Some of those introduced grasses are certainly producing more intense fires, gamba grass. The other is that where there's a whole lot of fires in a small geographic area, the remote sensing will detect a lot of power and energy release due to a lot of small fires. So some of them are due to just really extensive area being burnt, and some is due to the introduced grasses.
Thank you. There's a question related to the impact of sugarcane burning and the areas, and what are the impacts of that? I mean, obviously that's a crop residue issue.
It's included in the Global Fire Emissions Database on agricultural burns includes sugarcane burning, and the issues are really the same in places where where sugar's grown. South America, Australia, there's probably others I don't know about, but that affects a lot of places.
Yeah. Interesting point from Arabella Daniel, that she was saying that the human ignitions in the landscape is a major problem. And is there, potential for the Centre for Safe Air to help with a national discussion, a rethink education and prevention?
Human ignitions, it's an interesting question. That's on ignitions of wildfires. Human ignitions, the vast majority actually are accidental, but humans are flawed. We do have malicious people. How much the Centre for Safe Air can influence the discussion there, I'm not sure, to be honest. It's where there's people, these things will happen. And if we address that and not address all those other things I mentioned in terms of fuel loads, good fires, bad fires, planned burns, we're not going to help address the problem. So all of it needs consideration, and certainly the Centre for Safe Air has a role in the overall discussion. I'm less sure about the ignitions end of it, I guess, for our centre. It's certainly an important part of the conversation.
Okay. There's a question. We know that some fires, such as the indigenous burning, are not as harmful physically, but we do know that any exposure to wood heater smoke or wildfires are. So is it just a magnitude and scale issue, or number of days? Are there thresholds?
That's a fantastic question. So thank you for asking it. It's a couple of things, but it's largely a question of scale. These fires are tiny. They're really tiny. The emissions are tiny, but those right there at the interface will get some smoke, and then it's a case of how much smoke you get under this regime or under another regime, and how far that smoke goes. And I can tell you, in the Northern Territory where I've studied this, as traditional Aboriginal burning broke down, particularly 30s, 40s and 50s, air pollution in Darwin got steadily worse and worse and worse. So the overall population effect was negative because of the smoke. The effect on people around there lighting the fires, it's small, it's intermittent, but sure, it's a hazard. There's no threshold. It is an important exposure. So it's a question of scale and all the other health benefits that come with doing it.
Mm-hmm. So I think Sharon Campbell has just answered the question whether the Australian impacts were ocean surface cooling or heating. She's saying it's cooling, so we'll move on from that. A question from Anthony White is wondering whether anyone has done modelling of risk benefits of prescribed burning, and if so, is that based on health impacts or structural protection? He asks because studies seem to show that prescribed burning benefits seem to be dependent on location.
Yes, so the answer to that is it depends. It depends on the location and the context and how the prescribed burning is done. And I'm really pleased to see a lot more research in this area because that's the crucial thing. So some studies have shown estimates on loss of infrastructure and loss of life. A lot of studies have shown a concept of leverage, the amount of area you need to burn by prescribed fire to reduce, say 7 hectares of prescribed fire might reduce in geographic scope 1 area of wildfire. That's a common number for Southeast Australia. It's more 1-to-1 in tropical savannas. Then Nico Borchers has done some really interesting work looking at the human health costs per hectare of prescribed fire versus wildfire, and around the Sydney Basin area, it's actually higher for prescribed fire. The health impacts are higher per hectare. There's a lot more wildfire hectares burnt though. It's because prescribed fires by definition are right up there where people are living and breathing and working and go over populations. So I can't give you a clear answer because there's lots of different ways to look at it. And it's an area where we need a lot more research. And if there's ways of reducing fuels, we've got to manage fuels without burning or a combination of mechanical and burning, clearing and, burning in biomass energy, low scale, away from people. There's lots of creative solutions that we can explore. Like we can do a lot more in this area. Needs the research.
Always more research. There is a challenging question, which I'm not sure you'll be able to address at this point, but it's what really is an ideal natural landscape? What does that look like, both from views of societal safety and environmental health? So I'm not sure if that's something that you want to get into right now, but perhaps you could follow up with Anna Marie. I'm going to crucify the name, Jedram, hopefully
Anna.
later.
Values, place, it's all sorts of things.
Yes, a very valuable question, and I think something that needs a lot more consideration. Another question from Arabella, that she was very interested to know that that you had talked about managing vegetation around your homes is actually more effective in harm prevention than the prescribed burns. So is there a reference to that you could share more broadly?
I can find it for you. Owen Price, who's an investigator with us at the centre, was instrumental in that work, and there's other work as well. So Arabella, I'll get back to you.
Thank you. And Satiris asks, are peat fires considered as landscape fires? Indeed
they are. And they're certainly affected by climate change because they're drying out and they're becoming fuel.
Yep. A comment from Celia Roberts, wondering if you're aware of Stephen Pine's concept of the pyrocene. Do you find it useful?
I do. I do.
Perfect.
We probably don't have the time to go into it, but Stephen has been an incredible thought leader and conceptual thinker about fire on the planet and how humans relate to it. So I find a lot of his thoughts very helpful in thinking about fire.
And from Bronwyn King, wondering if there's a formal warning system for nearby schools, workplaces when a planned burning event is going ahead. It doesn't seem to be the case in Victoria, but perhaps there's something in other states that could be implemented.
Yeah, not that I know of for Tasmania. I think most places of Australia, we have work to do on communication around these things.
Yep. And I think just as a plug for the air quality forecasting system being developed, running through CSIRO, that perhaps that's an opportunity. And Deborah, yes, the access to the presentation will be made available through the website for the Centre for Safe Air. And Karen Grant asks, is there a definition of safe air, and are we in Australia on the trajectory of experience persistent unsafe air?
Okay, so that's a lovely question, a definition of safe air. Air pollution in the air has no clear threshold from when it goes. As you get more pollution in the air, there's more harm. And there's not a magic number where it becomes safe or unsafe. It's just as it goes up, increasing numbers of people will be affected. And so the philosophy really is to, where we can, we do what we can to drive down air pollution, knowing that we can never get rid of it. So we're never going to have zero pollution. Australia, by global standards, does well, but there's plenty of places where we can do better. And our risk is increasing because we're so fire prone. So that's probably where our biggest risk for increasing impacts is coming from.
Yeah. Shannon Rutherford says, as you mentioned, the home environment and garden is an important site of fire risk, and trees can be an important protector of extreme heat via shading and improving local biodiversity, but they're also problematic for fire risk and storm damage. And so do you know which all hazard species might be best in different parts of Australia? What is the best tree that we should be having in our gardens?
I can tell you, trees are crucial, right? And they filter embers, they protect in ember storms. We don't want to get rid of trees. It's just a case of whether they're up against our house or not. There's some fantastic work being done at the University of Tasmania Fire Centre. And I don't know if Stefania is on the call, but Anna is. And they're systematically burning garden plants and objectively rating them for their fire proneness. And the outcome of that, and Anna's working on the garden project, is getting a really rational way of improved garden design and what trees you plant and where you put them. So I can't give you a definite, here's the magic tree, but I can tell you that people are working on it.
Thank you. So most of the comments now are really, there's a lot of interest in those that research around plants and how to manage your space outside your home. So I think that that's probably something that we could think about sharing more broadly. But most of all, thank you, everybody. Yeah, all of the other responses now are just thanks. So I think we've done with questions, and we're up at the time limit as well. So thank you, Fay. That's been a great seminar and good start to 2024. And we look forward to inviting everybody to joining other seminars in going forward.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. See you.
Thank you. Bye.